Start. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes knight. Rook takes bishop. Checks in puzzle position are: Queen to e6, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen to d5, check. The puzzle is solved using: Queen to a5. Rook to c8. Queen takes bishop, check. Let's continue. The threats are: King takes bishop. Knight takes bishop, check. Checks in this position are: Knight takes bishop, check. The answer is: Knight takes bishop, check. King to b5. Knight to a3, check. King to c6. King takes pawn. King to d5. Knight to b5. Another one. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Here are the checks. Rook to f3, check. h4, check. Answer to this puzzle is: h4, check. King to g2. Rook to f2, check. King to g1. h3. Rook takes pawn, check. King to g6. One more. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is: King to c6. Knight to d8, check. King to d7. Knight to f7. b5. b5. b6. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are: Rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Rook takes pawn, check. The answer is: Rook to f4. Bishop to f5, check. Rook takes bishop. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Queen to h4, check. Queen to g3, check. Queen to g1, check. Queen to e2, check. Queen to d1, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is: Rook to e8. Queen takes pawn, check. Pawn takes queen. One more. Threats in this position are: King takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn, check. The checks are: Pawn takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: Pawn takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. King takes pawn. King to g6. h5, check. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is: Rook takes rook. Knight to f4, check. King to h6. Knight to e6, check. King takes pawn. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are: Knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using: f3. Knight to c5. Knight takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes rook, check. Pawn takes pawn. The checks are: Bishop takes rook, check. The best move in puzzle position is: Pawn takes pawn. Knight to g5. e5. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. Pawn takes pawn. Queen to g2. Bishop takes rook, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are: Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Here are the checks. Rook to c8, check. The best move in puzzle position is: Rook to c8, check. King to h7. Queen to h4, check. King to g6. Bishop to h5, check. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes queen. h2. Queen to g4, check. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using: King to f3. h4. King to f4. King to f6. g4. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: Rook takes rook. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to g1, check. Queen to e1, check. Solution to the puzzle is: Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Knight to d3. Rook to c2. Queen takes knight. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. There are no threats in this position. The checks are. Rook to G2, check. Rook to D1, check. Answer to this puzzle is. King to F2. Rook to E6. Rook to G5. Rook to F6. Rook to D5, check. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop. Rook takes pawn. Checks in this position are. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Queen to F3. Queen to C7. Bishop to D5. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes rook. One more, here are the threats. Knight takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Knight to F6, check. Knight takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using H4. Rook to E3. Queen takes rook. One more, the threats are. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to F5, check. Queen to E4, check. The answer is. Queen to E4, check. King to H8. Knight to G4. Knight to D8. Knight takes pawn. One more, here are the threats. Rook takes knight. Knight takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Knight takes knight, check. The puzzle is solved using. Knight takes knight, check. Bishop takes knight. Queen to B4. Rook to B1. Queen takes knight. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Knight takes rook. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to D8, check. Queen to G8, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to G7. Rook to D8. Rook to C3. Queen to A6. Knight takes rook. One more, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. F5. Next puzzle, puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is. Queen takes knight. G5. Knight to E4. Next puzzle, puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes queen. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are. Queen to E8, check. Queen to E6, check. Queen to E4, check. Queen to F3, check. Queen to C5, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Queen to G2. Queen to B5. Queen takes pawn, check. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Here are the checks. Rook to A8, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes pawn. Queen to D8. Rook to A8. Queen takes rook. Queen to H8, check. King to D7. Queen takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are. Bishop to D4, check. Queen to G3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to C2, check. Queen to B6, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Queen to B6, check. Queen to E3. Queen takes queen, check. King takes queen. Rook takes rook. Let's continue. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is. King to H8. Queen to E4. Pawn takes knight, check. Rook takes pawn. Queen to C5, check. Queen to C2. Queen takes rook, check. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.